Annual interest payments alone stand at 110 billion pounds. This is not actually debt repayment. This is just interest payments.
It's going into the pockets of the bankers.
Yeah.
That's the point,
That
right?
How do you go from being the richest, most advanced, and most powerful nation on the planet to being a second or third tier country that's falling apart at the seams? Well, we have a laboratory example of that right here where I'm sitting in London, the heart of great or not so great Britain. And with me to discuss that topic today is Adam Booth, the editor of The Communist, the paper of the Revolutionary Communist Party in Britain. Welcome to the show, Adam. This is your first time.
Yes, thank you very much for having me, Hamid.
Well, it's an absolute pleasure. I'm really looking forward to this discussion. There's been a whole series of articles. I've never seen anything like it, to be honest. Article after article with exactly or almost exactly the same headlines in the world's media, which is Britain ungovernable? What's the context of this?
Well, I think the fact that they all have the same headline is partly reflective of the fact that all these journalists exist in the same bubble. They go to the same parties.
Yeah.
They copy each other's articles. But I think more profoundly it reflects that there is a deep crisis in Britain right now, in British politics, particularly in the wake of the local elections, the May elections that happened just a couple of weeks ago, where Labour was absolutely trounced. You know, Starmer's Labour was already on the rocks. It's already, I think, Starmer's most unpopular prime minister in recent history. And basically, yeah, he was already looking like a dead man walking. And then these results look like they're really going to finish him off. Labour lost 1,500 council seats in England out of 2,500 that it was defending, which is about 60% of the councillors that they had going into that election.
Deliberately not condemning, it seems.
I want to begin with how you open it. So you're talking about Marco Rubio as a teenager working for his brother-in-law. The Trump administration reflects a sharp break with past U.S. administrations, not only in how it wields power at home, but how it wields power abroad. Not only do its domestic policies increasingly resemble those of all authoritarian states, even dictatorships, but its foreign policies are also characteristics of authoritarian states led by all-powerful demagogues. These policies are not strategic, but mercenary. They seek short-term gain over long-term stability. They prey on weaker states, even if these states are long-time allies. The political scientist Stephen Walt calls this predatory hegemony. Predatory hegemony demands tribute and obsequious deference, including the sycophantic flattering of Donald Trump, as well as deals that enrich him and his family personally in order to do business. Because countries are bound by trade agreements and economic dependence to the U.S., this predatory hegemony works in the short term. But in the long term, it is disastrous for the United States, pushing countries into other orbits, most notably China, and leaving the U.S. isolated and reviled. Even great powers need allies. Trump is shedding them one by one, imploding not only the world order set in place after World War II, but the financial stability, domestic tranquility, and power of the United States itself. Joining me to discuss the new world order rising from the ashes of the old is Stephen Walt, the Robert and Renee Belfer Professor of International Affairs at the Harvard Kennedy School. Professor Walt is the author of Taming American Power, Origins of Alliances, Revolution and War, and the Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy, which he wrote with the University of Chicago political scientist John Mearsheimer. You spoke before Trump took office, kind of reflecting on where we were headed. I think you were pretty much correct on most issues. What is it that has surprised you over the last year?
Well, there's several things that surprised me. I mean, first, I didn't expect Trump to do as much in foreign policy as he's done. I thought he would be focusing on all these domestic items, and certainly there's been sweeping changes they're attempting. The most radical transformation of American politics since the Civil War, maybe ever. But I thought that would be where most of the focus would go, and that foreign policy would be left to one side. But instead, you've seen an equally ambitious attempt to radically transform America's foreign relations, and done with surprising speed. So that surprised me. I was also surprised, of course, by the complete absence of any Republican Party pushback on all of this, either at home or abroad, particularly given that a fair number of Republicans had been sort of traditional internationalists, wanted the United States to be engaged, to exercise lots of global leadership, and they've been willing to go along with Trump's wrecking ball operation here.
Well, there's a kind of symbiotic relationship. The way he treats people at home, ICE, the ignoring the rule of law, 96 court orders in the month of January against the operations in Minneapolis, which they just ignore, Pam Bondi. But it's also reflected in the way he treats allies overseas, particularly in Europe. There does seem to be a kind of a uniformity into how he views power both abroad and both domestically.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it goes really back to, I think, Trump's basic worldview, the same worldview he exhibited throughout his business career, a sort of contempt for rules, contempt for laws. You can get away, and you can do whatever you can get away with, and a view that there's either, you're either weak or strong, you're either the victim or you're the winner here. And that's certainly how he has treated domestic opponents, belittling them, threatening them in a variety of ways, the way he's gone after media organizations, universities, anyone really who suggests that maybe he's wrong about something. But that's also been the way he's dealt with the outside world. And what's different about Trump, as opposed to, I think, every previous American president, is that he's engaged in these predatory acts, not just towards adversaries, where you can understand you want to always try and get the better of a genuine rival. Even when you're cooperating with a rival, say in arms control, you'd kind of like to get a deal that's favorable to you. But Trump's done that with just about everybody. Including some of America's closest allies, where all of these relationships are supposed to be structured and arranged so that the United States is getting the lion's share of the benefits and extracting as many concessions as possible on a wide range of issues using the leverage that we've built up over 75 or 80 years. And that's quite new. We really haven't seen that before by an American president.
It doesn't work It works in the short term, as I said in the introduction, but that's also true for his businesses. I mean, he was pretty washed up by the time he became a reality television star. I actually wrote a book called America: The Farewell Tour, and it was written out of the Trump casino in Atlantic City. And this was before Trump announced that he was running, but by the time I got there, half of the casino was mothballed. There were rodents running around the halls. People were shooting up in the elevators, eventually went into bankruptcy. And of course there he didn't pay his contractors. He took out loans he couldn't pay back that he had to renegotiate. That bankruptcy is kind of dogged him throughout his career, his sham universities, which kind of reminds me of the sham Gaza peace plan. But in terms of foreign policy, you make the point that because countries are inextricably bound, especially through the world financial system, they're captive at this moment to U.S. hegemony and U.S. power, but eventually blowback is coming.
Right. And it's very similar. I like the comparison to his business career because one of the things that happened, of course, over time was that more and more other businessmen didn't want to do any business with the guy because he was so unreliable. Not only did a lot of his schemes not work out, the casino business being one, but he was just an unreliable partner. He would promise you one thing and then never pay you, never deliver, not pay back loans promptly, tie you up in endless amounts of litigation. And therefore, eventually he just got the reputation of being someone you didn't want to do business with, at which point he had to become a reality TV star and then, of course, get into politics, the one place where you can actually get away with that kind of behavior for a relatively long period of time. I think you see the same problem arising in the international arena. There are countries that will make concessions. They will try to structure deals. We've seen that already. But of course, every time he goes back and tries to renegotiate it, we agreed to do something 6 months ago, but now I want to change the terms. I'm going to raise the tariffs again. Maybe I'll lower them if you're nice to me, etc. Eventually, even countries that would like to work with the United States in a constructive fashion will decide it's just not worth the risk. It's just not worth it to try and deal with such an unreliable partner, and they will take arrangements that might be suboptimal with others or might be not as desirable as what the United States is offering with others, because those other parties are going to actually keep their promises. The deal will actually stick. And I think, again, we're already starting to see lots of countries who are currently accommodating the United States in the short term also looking to find ways to de-risk, to reduce their vulnerability, to create alternative structures to one in which the United States has the central role. This isn't going to leave the United States, completely isolated. We're too big for that. But it's going to mean a long-term diminution in American wealth, power, influence, and security.
This is from the article you wrote, The Predatory Hegemon in Foreign Affairs. And you write about the unipolar era. This is with the collapse of the Soviet Union. You say the United States succumbed to hubris and became a rather careless and willful hegemon, facing no powerful opponents, and convinced that most states were eager to accept American leadership and embrace its liberal values. U.S. officials paid little attention to other states' concerns, embarked on costly and misguided crusades in Afghanistan, Iraq, and several other countries, adopted confrontational policies that drove China and Russia together, which was always, of course, what Henry Kissinger fought to avoid, and pushed to open global markets in ways that accelerated China's rise, increased global financial instability, and eventually provoked a domestic backlash that helped propel Trump to the White House. So all the seeds were set before Trump. He may have accelerated it, but explain a little bit about that hubris. And that, of course, saw the expansion of NATO with the confrontation with Russia.
Right. So hubris is, I think, the perfect word for it. People have to remember back to the 1990s, the end of the Cold War, the sense that the United States and its Western partners had won this historic victory, and that all the forces of history were now lined up in our favor. The wind was at our back. Democracy was the only game in town. You think about Frank Fukuyama's famous article about the end of history, suggesting that liberal capitalist democracy was really the only way to organize a society. We had the answer. You think of Tom Friedman's book, Lexus and the Olive Tree, which basically says American capitalism is the model that everyone else is going to have to converge on. China, if it wants to develop, is going to have to become a democracy as well as its middle class rises, etc. Other countries can't wait to be closely allied with the United States, can't wait to become democratic. And the only problem we have here is a few dictators in a few places who haven't gotten the memo. And we might have to deal with them in Iraq or Libya or elsewhere. But basically, creating a truly global liberal order is going to be relatively easy because everybody kind of understands that's where history is going. And that was the mindset of the 1990s and the aughts. And I think it led us, first of all, to NATO enlargement. without realizing that that was eventually going to provoke a direct confrontation with Russia. It certainly led us to promote democracy in lots of different places, including with the use of military force, such as in Iraq. And it also led us to promote globalization. And I'm a big believer in international trade, but of course we did it in a completely unthinking way, what my colleague Donnie Roderick likes to call hyper-globalization, and ignored the effects this was going to have on certain sectors of the labor market here in the United States, particularly manufacturing. And it was also going to create a financial system that was more delicate and fragile, which eventually then crashed in 2008. You put all of that together, right, a situation where a substantial number of Americans are not benefiting from globalization. People like me are benefiting. You know, the people, Wall Street bankers are really benefiting, but a lot of Americans aren't. And you couple that then with a series of foreign policy failures, the costs of which are borne mostly by soldiers, but not by the elites. And finally, an elite, Republican and Democrat, that doesn't hold anybody accountable, either for the financial crisis or for these foreign policy debacles. And that created, I think, the conditions where an outsider with no prior political experience could come in, issue a critique against all of that, and suddenly be taken seriously. Add to that this is a guy, Trump, who had spent 40 or 50 years learning how to market himself in very compelling ways, and you had the recipe for the 2016 election.
And it's a point that I know you have made, but it's an important one, is that although Trump comes out of that oligarchic class, he was never really accepted into the club. That inner sanctum, he was considered gauche, which he is, of course, crude, as you mentioned before, untrustworthy, so that his anger towards the elites is probably his one authentic emotion, but that's what connected. He never articulated, like Bernie Sanders, a particularly astute critique of power of the ruling class, both Republican and Democrat, but he hated it, and much of the American public hates it too.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, there's several aspects of it. First of all, it's the associating himself with the masses, with the people who are angry, which he does very effectively. Second, unlike Bernie, there are no really firm principles here. He has some prejudices, some beliefs, but he's tactically very flexible, willing to move wherever he thinks voters want to go. Famously, this whole line in the 2016 campaign about how he was going to build a wall and get Mexico to pay for it, that was not something he'd been thinking about. He hadn't been studying immigration. He just gave a speech at a rally one day, and he noticed that that was the big applause line. When he talked about building a wall, everybody cheered, and that became part of his speech ever after as well. The final thing is that Trump, is a very gifted rhetorician, not in a sort of elite fashion, but he never sounds smarter than his audience. He sounds like a guy you might meet in a bar, and who's got opinions and is entertaining and all of that. And I think that's part of what has created this very powerful bond with the MAGA base. He doesn't sound like, a guy who went to Harvard Law School, speaks in full paragraphs, etc. He speaks like an ordinary person, even though, of course, he's anything but, if you know his background.
So let's talk about the consequences. NATO kind of went rogue after the unification of Germany. It was designed as a defensive organization. Next thing you know, it shows up in Afghanistan and Iraq. But what are the shattering of these alliances going to do? I mean, that's what he's doing at the moment. You're watching in shock as these European nations scramble to kind of restructure their relationship with the United States. How is that going to play out?
Well, I think you're going to see European countries starting to chart a much more independent course. I mean, they didn't pick this fight. They would prefer to have a constructive relationship with the United States, but they're being forced to now chart an independent course. And I don't think you can rule out actually this combination of concerns about Russia to the east and concerns about the United States on the other side of the Atlantic, driving European countries, at least many of them, closer together than ever before, overcoming some of the lingering nationalist divisions between Europe because they essentially have no options. Second, over time, they're going to be less dependent on the American economy and therefore less receptive to American requests. I always like to use the example that the Biden administration went to the Dutch lithograph firm, ARM, which makes these lithograph machines that are essential for making the world's best semiconductor chips. And we went and said, look, we'd rather you didn't sell these to China. Now, ARM could make a lot of money selling those machines to China, but the Dutch went along with this because we were allies. They understood that we were concerned about it, and they had some reservations about doing business with China themselves. As Europe distances itself from the United States, if a subsequent American administration goes to a European country or a European firm and says, we think you should do this, we'd like you to do this because we're allies, you're not going to get the same kind of positive response. They're going to have to make other arrangements, and we're going to see the same thing happening in economic terms. In fact, I think that we're already seeing beginning to develop. Now, what that means over the longer term, do you get a rapprochement between Europe and China? I don't think so, but you're going to see a warmer relationship than you might have seen otherwise, and you're going to see other countries trying to find as many ways as possible to have options. That means American businesses won't sell as many things to China. Won't sell as many things to China or to Europe. Investors will be less willing to invest in the United States over time. Again, we won't disappear off the planet by any means, but the American position is going to be less favorable than it's been for most of our lifetimes.
At the moment, we have a stranglehold through control of the world financial system, don't we?
Yeah. Stranglehold might be a little bit too hard, but a very, very pronounced influence, not just because the dollar is the world's reserve currency and because the American economy is still enormous and people do want to do business, but also because most of the key nodes by which money is transferred from country to country are in fact controlled by the United States, because at some point they have to go through an American financial institution, again, because dollars are the reserve currency, and that allows the United States to block those transfers or cut people out of this financial network. This is a tactic we've used very effectively, say, with countries like Iran, essentially telling the rest of the world, if you do business with Iran, you're not going to be able to do business at all with the United States. And most countries then make the calculation that their business in the U.S. matters more than their business in Iran, and they go along with it. So this is a powerful tool, and it's one of the things that other countries are now trying to create alternatives, precisely because they don't want the United States to have this kind of coercive leverage.
Well, they've weaponized it to shut two ICC judges who ruled or issued arrest warrants for the former defense minister of Israel, Yoav Gallant, and Benjamin Netanyahu. They've used it against the UN Special Rapporteur of Palestine, Francesca Albanese, cutting them individually off the financial out of the financial system.
Right, and by the way, that's exactly the kind of behavior you would expect to see out of a predatory hegemon. Whenever you're in a position to make an example of someone, you do it, because you want to discourage anybody else from taking a step that might be seen as opposition, taking a step that might slow you down a little bit. Part of the strategy here is to discourage others from organizing against the United States, discourage them from rejecting American demands. So when someone is a thorn in the side, if you want to put it that way, you have to find a way to make an example of them.
One of the things that's fascinated me about the Trump administration and I think is indicative of the fact that they don't understand how power, especially power outside the borders of the United States, works, is how they have imploded the mechanisms of what I think Joseph Nye called soft power, USAID. USAID, which does provide all sorts of humanitarian aid, is also weaponized as a form of control. You look at Morales in Bolivia; they're kind of democracy institutes, which the AID funds to go after leftist governments. In Haiti, they wanted a new airport. Yeah, they said, well, you have to keep Cuba out of the Organization of American States. The closing of the Voice of America. I covered the revolutions in Eastern Europe. If you wanted to hear Václav Havel, who was no cheerleader for U.S. imperialism, you had to turn on the Voice of America. But talk about how, I mean, that's fascinated me. Because they don't understand how power works, they've actually accelerated this process of decoupling themselves or diminishing our influence.
Yeah,
not they wield military power.
Right, and that's, they think very much in hard power terms. And I must admit, I find this especially surprising, particularly is somebody like Secretary of State Marco Rubio ought to know better. Some of the people in the Trump administration, I don't think they know better, but Rubio does. And I think it's just an indication of the degree to which he has, sort of sold his soul for a position of influence. No one doubts that the United States has a mailed fist, right? That's well understood around the world. But of course, people will tolerate that mailed fist if it's got the velvet glove on it, and if the United States is, for all its mistakes, seen as primarily a benevolent force, not just out for gaining every single advantage. And that's a lot of what soft power, as my late colleague Joe Nye put it, was talking about. People who are willing to go along with you, willing to work with you, willing to partner with you in detail, because in some ways they admire what the United States stands for. They think its intentions are basically good, even if it sometimes makes mistakes. They want to emulate it in certain ways. They see it as admirable, whether it's doing impressive things like putting somebody on the moon or developing new technologies, or it's being generous. It's providing health aid in countries that need it. And these things don't cost very much, right? USAID was remarkably inexpensive. American foreign aid is, less than 1% of GDP. So we weren't putting a lot of money into this, and to sort of blithely cut all these things, to withdraw from, I think, 60 plus international organizations. These are all ways of symbolizing that we kind of don't care about the rest of the world anymore. And we're certainly not trying to do anything good for others unless they are closely politically aligned with us. Right, so we might help Viktor Orban in Hungary get reelected. We will certainly give a bailout or a credit line to Javier Milei in Argentina, because he's one of us. But doing good things for the rest of the world, that's not our business anymore. And this can't help but undermine American influence. The last thing, of course, is what's happening here at home. I mean, just imagine what it's like to sit in Canada, sit in Europe, sit in other parts of the world, and see what's happening in Minnesota, see the sort of abject cruelty of some of what's going on, seeing these ICE, essentially goon squads, in some cases gunning down innocent Americans who are monitoring what they're doing. This does not make the United States look like a country you want to be more like. It doesn't make the United States look like a country you might want to visit, etc. Tourism is down pretty dramatically here in the United States. And finally, it I think weakens us geopolitically, because we do have rivals in various parts of the world, and we no longer look like the sort of morally preferable alternative, which is saying something when you consider the character of some of our adversaries and rivals. There was in the article I mentioned this survey conducted by the Pew organization of looking at a bunch of countries and asking, do you feel more positively towards the United States or do you feel more positively towards China? And the United States is still slightly ahead, but it's almost even. And the report notes very clearly the trend is in China's favor. And of course, it's not surprising when you consider what the United States is doing to countries around the world, and also the image we're projecting by what's going on here at home.
So our two largest trading partners, it's not China, it's Mexico and Canada. And yet you're watching the Trump administration also dynamite those relationships. I'm mystified as to why. Maybe you have an idea.
Well, no, I think it's consistent with this, with his worldview. That first of all, that trade deals are basically bad unless we get such a one-sided share of the benefits. It's obvious it's in our favor. I actually think Trump prefers a deal where we get more than others do, even if we could get more in absolute terms by being more generous with them. And with respect to the United States, Canada, and Mexico, remember, Trump negotiated the current arrangements with them during his first term. And he declared at that time this was the greatest trade deal ever. It was a beautiful trade deal, all the usual hyperbole you get from him. He comes back in 4 years later. The deal hasn't changed, but now, of course, it's completely unacceptable. Now it's a deal in which Mexico and Canada are ripping us off. And again, he just wants to renegotiate this to try and get better terms. So what happens? Well, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, who, by the way, owes his election to Trump's policies towards Canada as well, has been very energetic in negotiating new trade arrangements for Canada to diversify away from the United States. A new trade deal with Indonesia. He's gone to China to mend fences with Beijing. He's, I think, probably the leading voice advocating essentially a link up between the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a 12-nation Asian trade deal, linking that up with the European Union and with Canada. So over time, you're going to see all of these countries, most of them medium powers, beginning to forge relationships that bypass the United States to the extent possible. It's not probably what they would prefer to do, but if your alternative is dealing with an unreliable and predatory Trump administration or dealing with some other countries who share, in most cases, some similar values and are simply more reliable partners, you'll go with the latter if you have the chance.
So Trump will throw out these, his quote-unquote peace plan, which is a joke, of course, although it was embraced mystified me, frankly, by the Security Council. He's attempting, on the one hand, to destroy international bodies such as the United Nations, and rhetorically, through his Board of Peace, he appears to be presenting an alternative, but it's not a serious alternative.
I think that's basically right. You should view most of these things roughly the same way one would view Trump University. That it's a Potemkin arrangement. It's clear that Trump, doesn't like international institutions. He sees all of these institutions as essentially rules that might constrain the United States. And again, throughout his career, this is a guy who doesn't like rules, doesn't like anything that gets in the way of what he wants to do. So instead, he wants to create his own independent version of the Security Council, which has, of course, when you call it a Board of Peace and you include some of the other people who are on it, when you invite Vladimir Putin to join, when you invite Benjamin Netanyahu to join.
And Sisi in Egypt.
Yeah, exactly. This doesn't exactly look like the usual set of diplomats and peace advocates you might expect to see. But I do think it is at part an effort to undercut the existing set of arrangements, which Lord knows have their limitations, have their problems, are badly in need of reform. But this is not a serious solution. Of course, it has this other element to it, which is we haven't talked about yet, and that's the fact that part of predatory hegemony is, of course, extracting benefits for Trump and his family themselves. I think it was the New York Times reported that he's made over $1 billion just in his second term, just in the time he's been back. Other countries have, Qatar has gifted him a plane. The UAE bought into his crypto company as well. To be a part of the Board of Peace, you have to pony up millions of dollars as well. All of this, I think, is eventually designed to also line his pockets in ways, again, we've never seen in all of American history.
You talk in the article about the adulation that he demands, this kind of fawning sycophancy. The Secretary General of NATO kind of, wins the prize for that. And although he has a kind of gargantuan ego, you also argue that it is itself a kind of form of, or a kind of consolidation of power.
Yeah, and it's very much the kind of cult of personality you see in authoritarian regimes, where you want to present the leader as this almost divine or magical figure, far superior to all other people, and therefore it makes perfect sense that they get to lead and do whatever they want, because they're wiser, smarter, more far-seeing, etc. And the more you can get people to talk that way about you, the more it discourages anyone from pointing out all the flaws. It becomes the chorus. And Trump's, I think, first of all, it does satisfy some deep psychological need, very narcissistic demand for praise. And then you see that in these cabinet meetings, where instead of going around and talking about the issues, you go around all these cabinet officials and they just talk about what a genius Trump is. But the other part of this, of course, is foreign leaders thinking that if I come in, if I flatter him, if I'm really nice, if I sit in front of the cameras and say nice things about him, I'll get a better deal. And I mentioned in the article sort of the extreme version of this was when the head of FIFA, the World Soccer Agency, gave Trump a peace prize, invented a peace prize and awarded it to him as well, to, of course, win favor, to reinforce this idea that Trump is sort of a magical figure that can't be criticized because he's so great. There is a downside to note about this. First of all, it doesn't seem to work, right? As you said, Secretary General Mark Rutte of NATO has been notoriously obsequious in dealing with Trump, and it doesn't seem to be doing much good. So accommodating him doesn't seem to win you a much long-term favor. But also, a number of leaders around the world are discovering that standing up to him actually is politically beneficial. I mentioned, Mark Carney got elected because he was the anti-Trump candidate in Canada, and he gets a standing ovation in Davos for pointing out the obvious, that other countries have to start countering what the United States is doing. He's very popular in Canada for this position as well. Lula in Brazil saw his popularity go up when he got into a spat with Trump as well. So I think you are going to see other leaders realize that kowtowing to Trump doesn't get you any good, may prompt something of a nationalist backlash in your own country as well, and that in fact taking a more principled position, defending your own country's interests, even in the face of American pressure, actually will pay political benefits.
You draw a historical parallel. You say predatory hegemony is not a new phenomena. It was the basis for Athens' relations with weaker city-states in its empire, a dominion that Pericles himself, the preeminent Athenian leader of his time, described as tyranny. Athens, of course, destroyed its democracy, as Thucydides points out, with the consolidation and creation of empire. What are the historical parallels that you see?
Well, there are differences. I mentioned, obviously, Athens, and that's a particularly instructive one, given that many Americans sort of look to Athens as this model that the United States is patterned on. The Chinese tributary empire of 500 to 800 years ago had elements of this. Certainly the idea of paying a formal tribute, formally acknowledging the superiority of Chinese culture, things like that. There's disagreements among historians as to just how exploitative that empire was, but it had similar qualities. The many European colonial empires were explicitly designed to be exploitative. There was a certain amount of propaganda about how this was supposed to be beneficial for the colonies as well. But the reason you wanted those colonies was to extract wealth from them and not necessarily have to pay for it. So that was clearly a part of it as well. There have been other examples you might point to: the Soviet control of Eastern Europe as an essentially predatory relationship as well. All of this was to say that it's not a new phenomenon. It is, I think, a new phenomenon in American foreign policy, that certainly the United States has engaged in predatory acts in the past, many in the developing world, in the Western Hemisphere, but generally not towards our friends, not towards the countries that we regarded as our closest allies. And even if you believed that, say, it was time to adjust America's overseas commitments, it was time for Europe to do more on defense, etc. It was time maybe to step back a little bit from hyperglobalization. The right way to do that would have been in a cooperative fashion, to sit down and work out a new division of labor with our partners, new trade arrangements that were a little bit more stable, didn't have quite the same consequences as what we'd been doing for the previous 30 years, without essentially saying, no, we're going to tear the whole thing up, and from now on, everything is about our getting the lion's share of every deal, and if you don't give us what we want, we're going to punish you. That, I think, is proving to be quite self-defeating.
Can you talk about the assault on diplomacy? They've gutted the State Department. You have these Witkoff, this businessman, and Trump's son-in-law negotiating. These people have no experience in the Middle East, culturally, historically, linguistically, illiterate in terms of the people they're dealing with. It reminds me of Ribbentrop or something, the former, well, he wasn't even selling champagne, he was selling fake champagne in Britain, becoming the Nazi foreign minister. But when your policy is just the mailed fist, what does it matter? But that's another example of an assault by the Trump administration that has radically changed our relationship with the rest of the world.
Yeah, I think there's no question. I mean, it's a little bit tricky because, in a sense, you could argue that diplomacy as a tool of American foreign policy has been in decline for a long time, as the Pentagon has become more important, more influential in shaping policy, where presidents have become more accustomed to relying upon military power as opposed to diplomatic solutions. We weren't thinking as much of the kinds of things like the Marshall Plan, which was a diplomatic arrangement of enormous benefit, or the Camp David Accords that Jimmy Carter negotiated, etc. We're just going to solve the problem with drones or with the 82nd Airborne or with other tools of military power. And so even before Trump, I think, we're seeing a declining influence of the State Department. And I might add, more foreign policy authority being consolidated inside the White House as opposed to over in the State Department. Trump has accelerated that. In his first term, he did. You had a sort of brief attempt to swing the pendulum back somewhat under Biden, but not very far, and a rather weak Secretary of State, in my view, in Blinken. But then under the second Trump administration, like everything else, they're going much faster, much farther. So, lots of people leaving the State Department, many ambassadorships left empty, withdrawing from 60-plus international organizations that are all involved in helping sort of set the rules and regulations by which global interactions occur. And as we leave those, right, other countries aren't, right? China's not leaving those organizations. If anything, they're more active than ever. which of course further enhances their influence. And I think this betrays Trump's sense that, he just hates the elite that he thinks has been running the country forever. He doesn't trust them. He always likes to blame the deep state for all of the problems he's had. That they wouldn't do what he wanted in his first term. They're the ones who got him impeached. So he doesn't want to have anything to do with them, which is why he appointed a Secretary of State who will do what he's told and not stand up to Trump in any significant manner. And that's why, of course, he's relying on a series of amateurs who are closely linked to Trump, who will also do what they're told in various ways. So you're dealing with extraordinarily difficult conflicts like Ukraine and Gaza and some others, what to do about Iran. And it's basically being done by people with very little expertise, and where the people who do know a lot about these regions and have some idea what might be required to actually advance a genuine political or diplomatic solution are marginalized or ignored, which is, I think, why you're not seeing anything that actually looks like a genuine political solution. You have the usual kind of Potemkin stuff that Trump will talk about, for a week or two and claim is the greatest peace deal ever, and then, we'll move on to something else and the conflict will go on.
Before I ask you the consequences, you talk about, which I thought was a really interesting point, that Trump often bluffs, and that when his bluff is called, it loses its power to coerce. You say if the United States does withdraw its military commitments, however, the leverage it once had over its former allies would evaporate. Either way, using the promise of American protection to extract a never-ending series of concessions is not a sustainable strategy.
Yeah. This idea really hadn't occurred to me till I was in the middle of writing the piece. But I began to realize that, again, the United States is taking advantage of relations that we've built up over many years, and where other countries, particularly our allies in Europe and Asia, have become accustomed to American protection, to the sense that the United States was going to be the first responder if something happened, if they got into serious trouble, and because they rely upon this, in the short term, you can threaten to say, if you don't do what I want, we're not going to honor Article 5 of the NATO treaty. Maybe we'll leave the organization entirely. You can do that once or twice, but of course, if being in that relationship is good for the United States too, if we get benefits from being in NATO, which we do, you can't deliver on the threat. And once you've threatened half a dozen times and never done it, it starts to lose its power. It's a little bit like a parent who keeps threatening to punish a child but never delivers. Eventually, the child understands the threat is meaningless. But by the same token, if you do evoke the threat, all right, fine, we're leaving NATO, then of course you've lost the leverage entirely. So if these relationships are still in America's interest, and I think they are, then, in a sense, the power to extract an endless series of concessions by constantly invoking the protection the United States has helped to provide is not going to work. It'll be a failing asset.
So where are we headed? You're definitely not headed in the direction that Thomas Friedman and Fukuyama predicted. And I don't see many impediments internally, certainly not within the Congress on Trump. What are the potential consequences?
Well, I think we are heading for a significantly more dangerous world. I think we're heading for a world in which you're going to have a series of competing power centers navigating around one another, not just a purely U.S.-China bipolar world, and where other countries are going to have to make their own calculations, largely independent of American influence. And I think that will have ultimately some destabilizing effects. We're heading for a world that's going to be somewhat poorer than it would be otherwise. I'm not saying it's going to get poorer, well, that's a possibility, but cooperative economic relations that might have been reached are going to be harder to reach. So we're all going to live a little bit worse as a result. We're going to be in a world that's warmer and therefore more conflictive because, of course, they're also retreating on the climate front. They're not willing to work with anyone. They're actively destroying efforts to advance climate-friendly policies here in the United States, and that will have then knock-on effects on migration and poverty and other things in other parts of the world. We're heading into a world that's going to be less healthy because we've withdrawn most of our public health programs out around the world, which means others will be sicker in other parts of the world. And some of those sicknesses will be more likely to get to the United States, where we won't be prepared because Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has been gutting public health here in the United States. So there's nothing really positive I see as you look out ahead on all of this. And it's why I end the article by saying, the sooner we abandon predatory hegemony, the better. But I can't claim to be optimistic that this administration will read that and reverse course.
But it also consolidates authoritarianism itself.
Yeah, there's no question that Trump likes to work with strongmen. That's his image of what proper leadership is. He's not happy with democracy. Democracy is the kind of thing where voters can vote you out of office. That's terrible. I don't want anything like that. He's very comfortable with people like Erdogan in Turkey and Putin in Russia, and he claims he's a great friend of Xi. He claims he got on very well with Kim Jong-un, and of course they've already made it clear that the leaders in Europe that they most like are the ones who share a similar view, like Viktor Orban in Hungary, like the AfD in Germany. So you suddenly have the United States, which for all of our hypocrisy and for all of our inconsistencies, has at least rhetorically and sometimes genuinely promoted a general sense of, liberty is a good thing, democracy is a good thing, people should be served by their governments, not the other way around, etc. We suddenly have that country, still very powerful, still very wealthy, still very influential, in a sense playing for the other team, right? And my great hope, of course, is that things will, that reactions here in the United States will be sufficiently powerful to bring this particular experiment with illiberal democracy, with creeping authoritarianism to a close as quickly as possible, and begin to shift things back towards a much more egalitarian society here, where political power is not limited to the wealthiest, an increasingly wealthy set of tech bros, and where the political institutions that need reform are reformed in a way that empowers people rather than elites.
Well, and as we speak, Trump and his allies are working overtime to subvert the midterm elections to prevent precisely that.
Right. Well, they've looked at they know what their approval ratings are, and they've seen what has happened in a series of elections ever since he was inaugurated. It's quite clear the American people do not like the direction they are taking the country, and therefore you can't let that view be expressed in a free and fair way in the midterms, because that could have a real constraining effect on what they're able to do subsequently.
Great. Thank you very much. And I want to thank Thomas, Diego, Max, and Sophia, who produced the show. You can find me at chrishedges.substack.com.
very much.
Today we discuss communism, Marxism, where we'll discuss what it is, where did it come from, and why did it succeed.
Public universities, private universities, colleges, and junior colleges receive billions of dollars in Department of Defense research contracts. But the university that consistently tops the list of Department of Defense research is the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. This research for the war industry focuses on information technology, nanotechnology, biotechnology, robotics, and weapons. It is not only designed to enhance the lethality of weapons systems, but to allow the Pentagon and the war industry to frame the questions at universities within the narrow confines of what C. Wright Mills calls the military definition of reality. Thus, the world outside our borders is viewed as a series of threats. It divides nations and groups into enemies and allies. It gives primacy, not to diplomacy, democracy, or cooperation, but to the use of force and coercion, whether through militarized violence, propaganda, and censorship, or the use of financial measures, including sanctions, to manipulate and force other countries to comply with our demands. MIT's Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory, led by Danila Rus, however, has gone a step further, carrying out research to assist the Israeli army's genocide in Gaza. Rus directs the project Coraset Compression Algorithms, which has received $425,000 in direct sponsorship from Israel's Ministry of Defense since 2021, according to MIT's 2024 Brown Books. The project she oversees develops algorithms for applications like city-scale observation systems and surveillance and vigilance. Many of these lightweight algorithms are ideal for teaching small unmanned vehicles, including drones, to track and pursue targets with increasing autonomy. Notably, navigating human environments is central. A human may provide the global path, and the robots will adapt their configuration automatically. These quad-rotor drones are used extensively by Israel to monitor, injure, and kill Palestinian civilians at close range, along with UN workers, journalists, and medical staff, including doctors, nurses, and medics. Students from the Coalition for Palestine at MIT, who have protested the university's collaboration, collusion with the genocide, or have questioned weapons manufacturers at MIT job fairs, who come to recruit MIT graduates, have been harassed, set upon by police, censored, brought before disciplinary committees, and suspended. MIT, like universities across the country, has shut down free speech in an effort to quash student discussion and dissent about the genocide. MIT sent several of these students no contact and no harassment orders for Professor Rus. It forced the Tech, the school newspaper, to retract an op-ed piece denouncing the collaboration with the Israeli military, and then suspended all opinion pieces by the paper. This comes directly after the suspension and effective expulsion of MIT PhD student Prahlad Angar, in part due to an email he sent to Rus's students offering support and a safe space to discuss her research. Joining me to discuss the targeting of students who speak out against the genocide and the collaboration of universities such as MIT with Israel's extermination campaign are MIT PhD students Prahlad Engar and Richard Solomon. So, Prahlad, let's begin with you, and I want you to spell out for viewers what it is these systems are doing. What is Israel hoping to get from MIT research?
Thanks for that question, Chris. The research projects at MIT primarily go toward drone research for the Israeli Ministry of Defense. So one of the projects is called heterogeneous autonomous drone swarms, right? So they're interested in figuring out how to create networks of drone swarms that can coordinate together to track targets, right? This project is led by Professor Eitan Modiano in the Laboratory for Information and Decision Systems. This project basically allows a drone swarm to be able to track moving targets. The explicit application includes vehicles in traffic. It could also include protesters in a demonstration, and it could include individuals going about their daily lives in Gaza. There's other projects, including core set compression algorithms, like you mentioned, which, although they seem to have only to do with mathematics and algorithmic work, are actually primed toward work for machine learning deployed on drones. So the issue with deploying machine learning algorithms on drones is that drones don't have that much capacity, don't have that much computational capacity on board, so they have to communicate back to a home drone. Core set compression is a method to reduce significantly the amount of computation that needs to be done to allow drones to perform machine learning assisted tasks. And these tasks include facial recognition. That is an explicit application cited in the paper by Daniela Rus. So, by introducing these technologies and by enabling these technologies, what is really being enabled by MIT's research for the Israeli military is the ability for drones to engage in tracking, in facial recognition, in targeting of Palestinians. And that's something that has been exposed over the last year, but even before then, as a very faulty system that the Israeli military uses to target Palestinians on a widespread basis, including civilian targets, mischaracterization and misidentification of civilians as combatants, including children as combatants. This also includes, the targeting of children. I mean, these quadcopters mounted with machine guns have been known to target children in their chest areas and in the head areas, clearly aiming for lethal wounds. A lot of people who argue for these ties and for this kind of research claim that this kind of research helps makes things more safe, helps makes attacks more precise. But what we've actually seen in practice is that the Israeli military uses these to pick targets, and then they've actually escalated their threshold for what is considered a casualty, a civilian casualty. They allow for 20 or even up to 100 casualties per attack. And in practice, what actually ends up happening is a lot more civilian casualties per attack without any guarantee of actually attacking any combatant. Of course, what this ultimately means is that MIT's research can enable a genocide, and in fact is enabling the ongoing genocide against Palestinians. So this is the type of research that's being done at MIT. I'm sure that there's plenty of other research going on at other universities and throughout the Israeli military-industrial complex. But this research in particular kind of leverages MIT's expertise and MIT researchers' expertise in machine learning, in artificial intelligence deployed in lightweight algorithms for genocidal purposes.
And the magazine in Israel 972 talked about how many of these targets are picked by AI. Are these drones essentially responding to human controllers, or are they being directed by algorithms?
So it's actually possible to do both with these technologies, right? It's possible to set a human control path. For example, for a drone swarm, it's possible to sort of coordinate them so that they follow a human-defined path. But then it's also possible for them to follow their own, kind of dynamically developed path based on, interruptions to the initial human-controlled path. What that ultimately means is drones are given much more autonomy to be able to carry out their killing spree. So it no longer, necessitates a human to be watching over them all the time. They can make resilient decisions that allow them to stay in the air and stay on target without any human oversight. This is an extremely dangerous development. Of course, it has been, the use of drone technology in warfare has been escalating, since well before, the current genocide, even through the Obama administration, and even before then. But these new capabilities, augmented by artificial intelligence, essentially allow humans to stop giving any oversight. And the limited oversight that is brought forth is basically a superficial check, right? A superficial checkbox that isn't really taking into account the devastation that these drones are wreaking upon Palestinians. And of course, it's not like the Israeli military is going to stop, even if they know that this is going to have massive humanitarian consequences. We've seen them, despite all of the warnings, despite all of the outcry from the international community, continue their genocidal onslaught against Palestinians. So this is definitely dangerous technology in dangerous hands.
Well, we know from the drone papers that were leaked by Daniel Hale and published in The Intercept that, in fact, most of the casualties, or most of the dead even, inflicted by drones in places like Afghanistan, where they had kind of remote drone operators in air bases in Nevada, were civilian casualties.
Yeah.
Yes, that's definitely the case, and I think that speaks to the fact that handing this over to AI is not going to solve things, right? It's only going to make things much worse. But Richard, go ahead.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I think this is part of a broader pattern in the history of warfare in capitalism and under Western empires, is to try to remove as much as possible a sense of human guilt and direct complicity. It used to be that you'd have to send in large armies and sit in trenches and fight each other. And now, people in Nevada can be on a computer screen and shooting and killing civilians in Yemen, and it doesn't have the same impact. And I think of AI and the kind of research that MIT is engaged in is a process of shifting the risks and the pain and the blood and the violence artificially to the war zone and away from the actual people who are calling the decisions and the shots. And this, I think, is a very scary development. And it means that people can tolerate even higher levels of organized violence against entire societies without feeling like they're the ones actually doing it.
Richard, I want to ask you, you speak Arabic, you were in the U.S. State Department. Like me, you spent a significant amount of time in the Muslim world, which I think gives you a perspective about what's happening that a lot of people don't have. I've spent quite a bit of time since October 7th, and twice been to Egypt and Jordan this summer, in the West Bank, 2 trips to Qatar. And I think what oftentimes is lost is how this genocide is playing out, especially among Muslims, but not just Muslims. I mean, anybody within the Arab world. And I wondered if you could just talk about that, because the rage and sense of impotence, and these were all something that I encountered no matter where I went, in Qatar, Egypt, or anywhere else. And you were in Saudi Arabia, of course. Just talk about that from, what it looks like from outside the United States.
Well, I'm an American citizen. I grew up here. I can't speak. I'm not Muslim. I'm Christian. I can't speak to that kind of rage, but I can say that the American diplomatic corps is a group of people who are completely segregated from the societies that they are oppressing. When they go to Cairo or to Lebanon or even to Saudi Arabia, they are living in armed garrisons, right? And even those of us like myself who will interview hundreds of people a day in the consular section are not engaging with people on a level playing field. I mean, you are the person, in my case, who is conferring on someone the privilege to move across borders, something that we all have as citizens in the global north, but they do not, especially in a place like the Gulf, where in many countries, the majority of the population is not even a citizen of that country, and are from, diverse backgrounds in the global South. They're the ones that face this kind of global apartheid regime. And so when the U.S. government, propelled by, all the different partisan party competition politics and the needs of empire and of resource extraction in a place like the Middle East. When we go over and we launch drone strikes into Yemen and create massive humanitarian catastrophes, those people don't get to leave the same way we do. And I think it was that dissonance between my position as someone who holds a black passport, diplomatic passport, can travel anywhere, is not subject to the same laws as everyone else, that diplomatic immunity. It's the dissonance between that and the consequences and the life opportunities that people face who are on they're on the other end of our violence. That is what kind of propelled me to leave the State Department. And I think most Americans don't see that every day, even the ones that go to the Middle East. I mean, they live in compounds, they have nice cafes, they are served by people from minoritized backgrounds. They don't speak Arabic. They live in a bubble, and in America it's almost more the case. And so, as soon as an attack like September 11th happens, people see it as coming out of nowhere, but it's part of a broader pattern of I think war and violence and authoritarianism in the Middle East that the U.S. government actively supports. And I don't think people often realize that the reason the U.S. government supports the monarchy in Jordan and the dictatorship in Egypt is related to Palestine. I mean, if those governments became democratic governments, there would be much more pressure on the regime to do something about the genocide of Palestinians and about the apartheid state. And so the U.S. has an interest in the suppression of democratic voices abroad. And that's an important part of the story. Oftentimes people will point to Israel as some sort of democracy in the Middle East, and they'll compare it to Egypt or Lebanon or Jordan. But if you adopt a more anti-imperial perspective, you'll see that, the suppression of the democratic voice in Egypt is part of why the state of Israel continues as an apartheid state. And that's not as much related to MIT in particular, but MIT definitely takes part in that with its very unique and illegal and unpopular and unprecedented relationships with Israeli military.
So let's talk a little bit about Lockheed Martin, job fair, and your experience there and what happened and the trajectory. I mean, you're in a pretty serious situation. I mean, you can explain all that, but 1 year suspension, which essentially is, I've heard you say, is at this point probably tantamount to expulsion. Explain what happened, because what I read what you're charged with, and it's just so tepid. It's I mean, frankly, I'm not in any way. I think what you did is great, but I mean, it's compared to the kind of radicalism of the 1960s, you seem to me incredibly respectful, polite. But talk about what happened.
Sure. No, I mean, I think you're exactly correct there. I mean, basically what happened was, I and many other people, went to the career fair that MIT hosts every year in the fall semester. It's a career fair where obviously students are looking for employment, internships, that sort of thing. And so, for us, it's a very odious thing for Lockheed Martin, which is, definitely a weapons manufacturing company, whose main mission in the world is to produce weapons of destruction that end lives and participate in these sorts of active genocides across the world.
They make Hellfire missiles.
Exactly, they make the Hellfire missiles that rain on Gaza right now. And so for me, and for many other people, it brings to mind the question: why are they here at MIT recruiting student labor for their mission? So I mean, the actual bare bones of what I and many other people did is we came, into the lines, waiting for a chance to speak to Lockheed Martin. I, personally spoke to one recruiter at length, and we talked about, my background, my interests, but then we started talking about the company and what the company is involved in, and expressed basically discomfort that it's involved in the current genocide against Palestinians, that it contributes to the climate disaster by manufacturing weapons of destruction that produce significant emissions that affect our environment, and asking about why they wanted to recruit labor for these kinds of projects. At that point, the first recruiter, because he wasn't really too much of an expert in civilian technologies, he didn't really know anything about my field either. He actually directed me to speak with his colleague, who is another recruiter at the career fair. So I went back in line and I stood in line to speak with that recruiter. And right as I was first in line to speak to that recruiter, the career fair staff at MIT decided to move the Lockheed Martin recruiters into a private room and take students one at a time to speak with them. And so I, moved along with them and moved, waited right outside in line, right outside of the room. And, the video evidence that was submitted against me in my discipline case, probably like 80% of the video is just me standing outside of a door on my phone or talking to some friends or something like that. And there's no indication of any sort of, I didn't even get the chance to interact with any more Lockheed Martin recruiters because at some point later they decided to leave the fair. But I, fast forward a few weeks later, and I got a disciplinary notice that said that I was charged with harassment and intimidation of the Lockheed Martin recruiters, creating an environment that was so unsafe for them that they had to leave via an Uber Black, right? The most expensive Uber option for some reason. So, this sort of manufacturing of the narrative here makes it seem like we're a threat when in reality all we did was ask them questions, right? I mean, the way that I participated in the career fair is the way that I expect anybody to be able to participate in a career fair, asking recruiters questions, having a resume, wanting them to read the resume or to take it, speaking with them about ethical concerns. I mean, these are things that I expect people to do at career fairs in general. The fact that I was specifically targeted and others were specifically targeted for doing that with Lockheed Martin indicates the sort of bias against the organizing body at MIT. And then a few weeks later, in November, actually at the beginning of November, I received another charge, and this charge was regarding an essay that I had written for one of our student zines called The Written Revolution. My essay was about pacifism, and it was about kind of a critical analysis of the role of pacifism within liberation movements and leftist movements. And for writing that essay, I was charged with harassment and intimidation. It had the essay was submitted to a student-run zine. I am one of the folks who runs the zine. Nobody in the club said that there was harassment or intimidation. It was people who decided to pick up our magazine and read it. And found the content so odious that they decided to report it for harassment and intimidation. But on the basis of that article and the email that you mentioned, I was banned from campus, and I'm still banned from campus to this day. Later on, because of the pressure that we had put against MIT for this violation of free speech, MIT decided to split my discipline cases into two separate cases. So instead of grouping them all together and trying to paint me as a repeat offender, they didn't like the fact that there was so much scrutiny over the magazine article, so they split it up, suspended me for the interaction with the Lockheed Martin recruiters, and they told me that if I get charged with harassment or intimidation again, then it is likely going to result in expulsion. What did I receive after that? I received, immediately after receiving the decision about the suspension, a few weeks later, I actually received another notice that I'm going to be put in front of the disciplinary committee for harassment and intimidation for my article. In other words, they're basically setting it up for expulsion. There's no other way to put it. There's no kind of way to sugarcoat that. They have clearly an agenda. I think that agenda has been set by right-wing pressure on MIT, including, in last December, there was a subpoena or there was an appearance of the MIT president to Congress, and she was questioned about anti-Semitism with regard to the Palestine movement, right? I mean, anti-Semitism is something that we should all condemn, but of course, what they're talking about when they say anti-Semitism is really political anti-Zionism. right, which has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. But at the end of the day, what they're really doing is caving into these pressures and setting things up so that I will be expelled from the institute for voicing my political opinion and for participating in protest activity in general. And of course, this is all targeted behavior because they know that I'm someone who's active in the pro-Palestine community, and they're hoping to sort of decapitate the movement by targeting leaders that they can recognize.
Yeah, and you have a grant that allows you to study for your doctorate, which you can explain the details of that you're now in jeopardy of losing. Is that correct?
That's correct. I received the National Science Foundation Fellowship, which is a fellowship that lasts 5 years. It funds 3 out of 5 years, and you can kind of choose which 3 of those years. But if you are not registered as a student during any time, any time in that period of 5 years, the remainder of the grant will be forfeit. So by forcibly suspending me, they are actually basically getting rid of my funding. And I think it's a tragedy, not just for my own research, but of course this is a very prestigious fellowship. It's something that it's a case where I've been recognized for my own scientific achievements. But MIT, of course, wants to target me and wants to get rid of this funding so that the path toward expulsion can be smoother for them. And I think there's no question of the fact that they've calculated that into their move.
And the committee has said if you do, you have to go back to the same disciplinary committee in order to be, in essence, readmitted to the university. But I found I'm going to sum it up. You probably know the exact words. But basically, you have to grovel and promise to completely be obsequious to the centers of power in order for that suspension to be lifted. Is that correct?
That is correct. They specifically said that I'll have to convince them that my political expression can be within institute expectations. And that's something that to me is very chilling. The fact that they can set expectations for how political expression ought to be done is a very chilling thing. And it's something that I have to convince the committee of before being readmitted, which is another reason I think that they've effectively expelled me.
Yeah. And
before I go to Richard, I just want to ask you what it is that brought you to the Palestine question. All of us in the humanities never think of you like brilliant STEM people as kind of walking into those areas. I hold both of you, of course, with great admiration. But what is it that brought you to stand up?
I think I would say, I learned of Palestine from a friend of mine in undergrad when I went to Georgia Tech, and her family is Palestinian. They're from Ramallah, and I learned about the ongoing settler occupation, the experience of apartheid, the experience of genocide that her ancestors had felt in Palestine, and I think learning all of that had a profound effect on me because I up to that point hadn't realized that there was this much history behind an area that I'd only ever heard of things like peace in the Middle East and jokes made about that and these kind of like large themes that people were talking about. The more I learned about it, the more I realized that when they say peace in the Middle East, what they're specifically talking about is Palestine, and they're talking about the subjugation of Palestinians to the point where they can force peace. And that didn't sit right with me, right? The idea that this narrative of Palestinians is being entirely squashed by American empire. So since then, and since the Sheikh Jarrah evictions, which were going on during my in my undergraduate time, which is another example, of course, of ethnic cleansing against Palestinians, I've paid attention to the Palestinian cause. I've tried to use my voice to uplift it, and obviously since October 7th, that has required heightened action.
Go ahead, Richard.
Yeah, I was just going to say that what Prahlad experienced and what many of us have experienced being suspended and banned from campus, I mean, dozens of people, right? I see it as a broader pattern in the weaponization of narratives of harassment, and the elevation of feelings of Zionist faculty and students over the lives of Palestinians, and over any opportunity for them to be held accountable. And other people who have spoken out against Daniela Rus, who have written on public chalkboards, who have asked her questions during Q&A sessions at the many events and award events that she goes to. They've also been given no contact orders. The student newspaper, as you pointed out, which published our opinion piece calling on Daniela Rus to step up and show some moral backbone and end her connections with the Israeli military, that was taken down under the assumption that it was fueling harassment. And I see this kind of as part of a winning formula. I mean, we know the schools, not just MIT, but they've gathered over the summer and they've shared their wisdom and experience about how best to suppress dissent to what they're doing. And I think they've figured out that if they can frame political speech as a form of harassment, it will work. And in some ways, this is kind of ironic because and I think you pointed this out really well, when compared to the 60s and 70s, when Noam Chomsky was here at MIT, the students would riot. I mean, they barricaded buildings. They built a battering ram and rammed down the office of the president to speak with him. I think at Columbia, the president was taken hostage for a day. Like, this was part of that political culture. And whereas now, when we are, I think, extremely deferential to norms of politeness, we're still kind of given the short end and the bat. And I think it's because they're very scared. I mean, they know that the movement at MIT is very popular. I mean, a lot of us might be very outspoken, but we asked the students themselves in a series of referenda across the entire campus, do you support ending these ties with the Israeli military? And the super majorities came back, yes, we want this ended. If MIT did it, for the genocide in Darfur in 2008, if they could divest from the Draper labs, if they could at one point, I think in 2022, they ended their relationships with a Russian university that they had helped establish. I mean, if they can do those things over political crimes and acts and recognize them as political moves, they can also do the same for the Palestinians. That's my personal opinion, but I'll let you ask a question.
So, Richard, talk a little bit about, I didn't ask Prahlad about this, the ties with Elbit Systems and with, I said Feldman. There's a professor in, I don't know where they are, Tel Aviv or somewhere, but talk a little bit about the direct ties with Israel.
Right. So, back in March and April, when we had published our findings about MIT's direct research ties to the Israeli military, they came back and told us that this is a form of academic freedom. We cannot tell faculty what to do, and so on. It's not an institutional collaboration, and all the other examples we had cited for divestment were institutional collaboration as well. MIT has a direct tie with Elbit Systems.
You should just explain what Elbit Systems is. It's
yes.
I mean, you know. Go ahead. Just for people who don't know.
Elbit, for those who don't know, is Israel's largest defense contractor. They build killer drones, surveillance drones, and technology. This is used within the occupation in the West Bank and Gaza. It's also exported abroad. For instance, to Azerbaijan, when they committed the ethnic cleansing of Artsakh in September of 2023. I think the Indian military is a significant purchaser of these drones and technologies. Well, MIT has kind of a direct institutional collaboration with Elbit through what they call the Industrial Liaison Program. This program gives Elbit privileged access to the campus, to MIT faculty and expertise. Typically, and probably you can correct me if I'm wrong, There's a grant that Elbit gives to a faculty member, and they negotiate over some sort of research opportunity. This also allows Elbit to recruit, MIT graduates or students who are graduating into its company. And then, as we pointed out with Dan Feldman, who is an Israeli researcher with ties to Elbit at the University of Haifa, he and Daniela Rus have been working on this Corset compression algorithms project for a while. Daniela Rus has also co-authored papers with top AI engineers at Elbit Systems. We know that from public information. This does not require any sort of hacking. You simply look them up on LinkedIn, you read their papers, you find who they're co-authoring with, you see who they're thanking as sponsors. It's very clear and it's very out in the open. When we publish these findings, of course, it's considered harassment. But they're very proud of it when they boast about it to their own circles. It's only when it's cast in a critical light in the mass media, in the student media, in campus politics, that they begin to see it as a threat.
I'll also
Richard, let me, before I prelude, just tell me about, because you're a political science PhD student. A lot of people probably don't know MIT as a political science program. And you had mentioned before we went on the air, war games. I mean, just talk a little bit about how deep the roots of the war industry go into even the humanities.
Right. Well, I don't want to get in too much trouble with my faculty advisors and all that, because I'm kind of on thin ice. But I will say that the security studies program at MIT, which is part of the political science department, they have a number of military fellows that come every year. They literally sit in offices on Saturday mornings and pretend like they're at war with each other in different rooms on their computers. And, for the faculty and for researchers and scientists, this is seen as like useful in understanding how wars unfold and so on. My concern with all of this, and it's a long-standing theme in MIT's relationships with the Pentagon, is that they're trying to help the U.S. military perfect the tools of industrialized organized violence against people. These are not tools that are designed to help, a country defending itself against an invasion. That's not the United States, right? And I don't know enough about the programs in particular, but I would say that, these are often so-called conventional wars, like between countries, when they sit there on their war games. But there are also these insurgencies. There are also things like how to best, dismantle Hezbollah or some other non-state group, and that's a political question too. It's not just a military one. And I think if we don't reflect on the political nature of what we're doing and also the moral one, those kinds of activities, I think, are bound to only increase the capacity of the world's largest superpower, a nuclear-armed state with military bases across the entire world, right? That's not like a neutral scientific question. And I think a lot of what Prahlad and I and our colleagues who represent the majority of the voice on campus are trying to do is to politicize people into thinking of their research not as morally neutral. You can't just sit there and build drones and not talk about who it's serving and who does it help. I mean, a lot of us are here because we believe that our science has an emancipatory power to repair, to heal, to help with human flourishing. And unfortunately, that's not really what we see in the kinds of research that's being done. And I think that's related to who is sponsoring the research, right? I mean, everybody recognizes by now that when the tobacco industry is sponsoring studies on lung cancer, it's bound to be biased, right? The same applies to the pharmaceutical industry, or to sugar, or to the oil industry and climate research, which is another.
Right, BP sponsoring climate science.
Right? And so the same principle should apply to militaries when they're sponsoring research at academic institutions. And unfortunately, the leadership of MIT has been ignoring the kind of collective voice of the campus and of the country and of the world, and saying that we want, we want to distance ourselves from the military, and we want our research to affirm human life and not human death and organized violence, right?
Go ahead. You were going to say something, Prahlad, and then I had a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to add maybe two more notes about Elbit Systems and Daniela Rus's complicity there. The one more thing to note about Elbit Systems and the way that Daniela Rus has engaged with them is, she has tried in her the pressure that she put on the Tech, which is the newspaper at MIT, when she kind of put pressure to force them to retract the article that the coalition had published about her ties. She tried to make it seem that her research is purely mathematical, that it has no military application, that it could not be applied in the military context in the way that we had published about. But in reality, a presentation of the exact title of her project, which is called core set compression algorithms. So a presentation exactly about these core set compression algorithms was given by Dan Feldman, her collaborator and former postdoc, who now works at who's now a professor at the University of Haifa. He gave a presentation about core set compression algorithms to Elbit Systems. Elbit Systems is not, a conglomerate of multiple different types of research and avenues of human productivity. It is purely a defense contractor. That is purely its job. So to present those algorithms in front of Elbit Systems means that researchers at Elbit think that they're interesting for their own uses, and researchers at University of Haifa and at MIT see an opportunity in working with Elbit Systems. And as Richard mentioned, Elbit Systems is complicit not only in the genocide in Gaza, but also in the ongoing occupation in Kashmir. Also, technology from Elbit Systems is used along the border between the US and Mexico for surveillance. So there's a lot of complicity to be found there. The last thing I'll mention is, Richard mentioned this very important and destructive narrative that's coming from these universities about harassment. And that's the narrative that, of course, Daniela Rus has used to claim that these criticisms of her research practices and her research partnerships are harassing her as a private member of the MIT Institute, right? As somebody who is a private citizen of MIT and not a public official or somebody in a public role like the president or the chancellor. Well, Daniela Rus actually happened to spend some of her time in the last 5 years on the Defense Innovation Board briefing the Pentagon. She has served in government roles in a capacity for the government, right? I mean, these are roles that directly brief the Pentagon, right? She's been in calls with multiple military leaders who report directly to the Pentagon. So, I mean, I think it's absolutely ridiculous for anyone to try to claim, especially the MIT disciplinary process, to try to claim that, this constitutes harassment of a private individual. She certainly takes every opportunity she can to be as public facing, right? She's as she possibly can when she promotes her startup, when she engages with the DoD, when she tries to seek these opportunities for increasing her own image and self-importance. But when it comes to criticism against her, she tries to retreat behind the MIT name and pretend that she's not a public figure. Again, she's the director of an entire laboratory, the Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory, which houses multiple professors and many different projects at MIT. She is clearly a public figure, and is subject and should be and ought to be subject to criticism for her research practices and for who she chooses to engage with in her research partnerships.
So I have to ask you, Prahlad, you're clearly the poster child. You're the MIT's, what they've done to you, you're the message. You stand up the way Prashad stands up, and you lose your grant, you are expelled, your career is in jeopardy, you can't get a job at Lockheed Martin. I don't don't think you want one. So where do we go from here? I mean, I find this moment very frightening because they're not going back in terms of the imposition of these draconian measures. The genocide, we have Israeli officials in the last week talking about months, years more of genocide, which of course is just bringing the extermination process to fruition. You're right about the 60s. I was a boy. My father was an anti-war activist, a civil rights activist. Daniel, the great radical Catholic priest, Daniel Berrigan, who was a friend, baptized my youngest daughter. I mean, they broke into weapon systems, poured blood over missiles, burned draft records. Thinking about this moment, we have to stand up. I've got to believe that to a certain extent there's also a kind of catering on the part of these administrations to the incoming Trump administration. I'll ask you first, and then I'll ask Richard, you know, what that great line from Lenin, you know, what must be done?
I think, I mean, it's a grand question, and I think I as one individual can't necessarily claim to answer what must be done, in its totality. But from my perspective, as much as they try to attack us, like when their repression is the harshest, and when their repression is reaching this contradictory point, that is the moment where they are the most vulnerable. I think MIT is extremely vulnerable because at this point we have exposed MIT as the weakest chain in the Zionist armor, right? It's one thing for many universities and many SJPs at universities to demand divestment from the Israeli entity, right? By divestment from these corporate partnerships, etc. But it's a whole different story. It's a whole different ballgame when you start to realize that these universities are directly doing research for the Israeli Ministry of Defense. And as we were talking about just before we started recording, other universities have reached out to us, contacting us about the possibility of doing this type of research in their own universities, right? Trying to find out, where are we complicit? Are we doing research with the Israeli Ministry of Defense? Is it more than just divestment? And across the board, I think the answer is yes. You'll find that a lot of places have this type of complicity, are not just partnering with companies like Lockheed Martin, but are directly doing research with the Israeli Ministry of Defense, either through corporate ties or directly through their own research. And this is the case at several other universities, which have now popped up, finding this research because they saw the research that we had done at MIT. So for me, this is the moment where we strike hardest. We continue to persevere and to make sure that we speak truth to power. The repression that they hand down is definitely not the end of the story. I mean, it can be scary at certain times, but there's been a lot of people who have faced repression and can continue to speak out. And of course, many of those folks from the 60s faced significant repression from the state and from their own institutions, and today are not just doing just fine, but have laid out the roadmap for how to survive under that level of scrutiny, and how to make a living under that level of scrutiny. I think it's important for people to recognize that we must do what we can to support the people of Gaza, to support the people of Lebanon, to support the people of Yemen, of Sudan, and of course of the DRC, of the Congo, and rise up and make sure that the globally oppressed do not go voiceless in these systems of empire, right? That they get represented and that they get their voices heard. And sometimes their voices, yes, call for the dismantling. In fact, pretty much in all times, their voices call for the dismantling of these imperial systems. So, as far as where we go next specifically, I think that requires a diversity of tactics. People need to be ready to embrace, more hardline tactics, but also broad public education and awareness tactics to make sure that people, that we can create the popular cradle for the change that is necessary to end this genocide. And I think that requires us to be bold. It requires us to face this repression head on, to create mutual aid networks to make sure that we, can take care of the people who are facing this level of repression, and also make sure that we don't, end up shooting ourselves in the foot by making ourselves reliant upon these institutions that don't actually value us for our opinion, but only for our labor, such as MIT. So I think establishing those networks, making sure that we can create that popular cradle will be really important so that we can diversify our tactics going forward and really take it to the war machine.
Well, you've done what so few students in elite institutions have been willing to do, which is jeopardize your own degree, your own advancement within that institution. What would you say to them, and how does it feel to be in your situation?
I've reflected on this quite a bit about how it feels to be in this situation. I mean, in a large part, it feels surreal. But I will say, a few weeks ago, a friend of mine sent me a video of these Palestinian school children who were handed a pair of headphones, much like the one I'm wearing. And over that pair of headphones, they heard the sound of the school bell. And it's a sound that they hadn't heard in over a year. And it brought tears to their eyes. I mean, they started breaking down and crying, remembering the joy of being in school, the joy of being with their peers and their teachers and their classmates, many of whom have probably been killed by these airstrikes by the Israeli military. Probably all of whom have been displaced from their homes. This might be the second or third or fourth displacement in their family, across the generations since the Nakba of 1948. And they still persevere, right? So for the school children of Gaza, they don't even have the opportunity to mourn not being in class or not seeing their friends at school. They have to survive a genocide, and that was seeing that video reminded me that regardless of what we face here, it is nowhere close to having to face an active genocide against your people. And in many ways, it is our duty to put ourselves on the line in this way. Regardless of the repression that we face, to make sure that those voices are heard, and to make sure that at some point in the future, Palestinian children can return to school, that the Palestinian society can come to fruition, that the Palestinians get the state that they deserve and are able to end the ongoing settler occupation of their lands. I think it's really important for us to keep that focus when we think about the actions that we take here.
And Richard?
Yeah, I would agree with Prahlad that our role as students at these universities is twofold. The first is to raise the cost of war until its masters ended. That's a quote from Mike Albert, who was a kind of 1960s era student activist and leader who was expelled from MIT, and it continued. He had these relationships with Noam Chomsky. And I think that the other thing that we can do as students is one, to signal to the world that these projects of Zionism, of apartheid, of occupation, they're losing their legitimacy and their support by educated generations of people, and that requires perseverance. I mean, it's taken like maybe 12, 13 months for Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International to declare formally that what's happening in Gaza is a genocide in intent and effect. It took time for that, but there's a consensus growing, I think, a moral consensus that this can't continue. And as a student of politics, when I look back, and I derive great inspiration from the struggle of the Irish for unification and for the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa. And in both cases, I mean, it took years and years and years for their struggle to bear fruit. I mean, Ireland's a story of like centuries of struggle against settler colonialism. And what happens isn't necessarily that they definitively beat the forces of the state on the battlefield, right? But they do fatigue their enemy, and they persevere long enough that the publics, whether within the country, for instance, within the British Empire, or in South Africa, the global public decides that we can't support this any longer. And with Israel in particular, I think it's a political formation that is much more fragile than we think. And that's due to, one, its very unique dependence on American public finance, weapons, state aid, philanthropy. These are connections that can be cut fairly quickly. And the second is its demographic fragility. I mean, the Israeli productive economy, to use that phrase in quotes, is relying on a very thin base of educated people. And if those people decide that it's not in their interest to raise families in a war zone anymore, if the Palestinians can raise the costs of general life under occupation to be so extreme that nobody wants to live there anymore and they'd rather emigrate, to Europe or the United States, then a lot of that economy is going to collapse. And so I think it's in our interest, and it's part of our vision to see a future for the Holy Land that's more just and equal and democratic. And to that end, we just continue. I mean, at MIT, despite all the oppression, we're continuing to grow. I mean, we're adding more student groups. We had the Latino Cultural Center and Trans at MIT both join our coalition. We passed a resolution, the Graduate Student Council, to sever all ties with Israeli military. There's some rumors that MIT could reschedule some of these research funding contracts it has with Israeli military. That would be a great win for us in the public theater. So I think for me, when I'm tempted to give up, I think like Prala did about the Palestinians I know. I mean, my own host brother in Gaza, Mohammed Musbah, stayed at my family's house in Georgia for several months to get a prosthetic limb. He lost his leg during the Great March of Return protests in 2018, 2019, when Israeli snipers shot off his leg. We were happy to give him, a chance to walk again through the BCRF. He went back to Gaza. He got married. He had a small child, and in August, he and many of his family members, his parents and his brother, were killed in Israeli airstrikes. And when I think about giving up, I think about his child, who is still alive, Hala. She's 2 years old. I don't think that I have, any excuse to give up or say that, this is too hot, this is too risky for my career. I mean, for me as a Christian, I think that the point of living is to love people and to strive for a world that's better. And I think for me in this particular moment in world history, that's the Palestinian struggle for liberation. And it will likely evolve and branch out. But I think for all people in the world right now, I mean, this is our Vietnam War. This is our, anti-apartheid struggle. Generations of people are going to look back at those who were alive and ask them, what did you do to stop a genocide? Did you just stay quiet? Did you side with the forces of violence and death, or did you speak up? And I think that can be very difficult, and it can cost you your reputation, but in the end you'll find that your soul is much more free, and you're much more at peace with yourself because you're on the right side of history and of humanity.
Well, amen to that. When you confront radical evil, it always has a cost, even at times the cost of your life. They can take away your MIT PhDs, but they can't take away your moral courage and your integrity, both of which you have and which I admire. Thank you very much. I want to thank Sophia and Diego, Max, and Thomas, who produced the show. You can find me at chrishedges.substack.com.
Life is just tough, dude. You know what? It is tough out here for a cat. It is tough, dude. Tough, I tell you what. There you go. The wrong way. I might have broke the key. Great. I think I warped the key on that one. Lesson learned. Oh, well, let's see if I have juice. So many pretty lights. 1, 2, 3, 4. F4. The number 2. F5. The number 3. The number 6. The number 4. E. Wait, I can't hit Alt Tab. Not just yet. Hey, yeah.
It was kind of a shock to me.
Yeah, we had the same thing during the war in Yugoslavia. We used to interview Serbs who were artists and well-educated, and we called it the Linda Blair effect, because as soon as they started talking about Muslims, their heads started to spin around and around and around, like, of course, fanatical Zionists. Let's talk about the West Bank. I was in the West Bank this summer. The genocidal tactics that are commonplace in Gaza are increasingly being used in the West Bank. And you have a very good report called On the Silent War in the West Bank, and perhaps you can because we're not showing the whole clip. Just explain what it is we're going to see.
Sure. So shortly after October 7th, no journalists are allowed in Gaza, and so I went to the West Bank. I wanted to, be with the Palestinians, after this war began, see what they were dealing with in the occupied West Bank, see what life was like. And after the war began, the hundreds of thousands of settlers in the West Bank who were illegally there, they were all turned in to military reservists, all of them. All of the the military-aged ones. So they were given.
To be clear, Jeremy, that's over 700. There are 700,000 colonists in the West Bank. We're talking about a pretty large number.
Yeah, a giant number. They were all given, military uniforms. Some settlements were given Humvees. They were given guns, even though they already had guns. They were given guns, and they were kind of given carte blanche to do what they already wanted to do, and were already doing, at a very in a smaller, frequency. They wanted to cleanse the Palestinians of the West Bank. They wanted to, get rid of them. They wanted to get rid of villages and then put in paperwork and build more Jewish settlements, more apartment buildings. And so no one was there. No one's there post October 7th. The military, the police were not there to, kind of, break up the fighting or stop the settlers from doing things that are illegal. I mean, their entire existence there is illegal, but from being extra violent. So the military and the settlers were working together after October 7th to get rid of the Palestinians in the West Bank while all eyes were in Gaza.
Yeah, they created rogue militias. It's been the largest land seizure in the West Bank since the Israeli occupation, I think 30% of the Jordan Valley, if I have that right. And they have created reigns of terror by going into these Palestinian villages. And you're in one of these villages.
Yeah, of course.
The thousands of Palestinians from villages that have already been cleansed and displaced from their rural lands have had to find land away from settlers and pitch tents. Residents of this village were told by settlers accompanied by the Israeli military that if they did not vacate their land in 24 hours, they would all be killed. Entire bedrooms remain, children's toys, school books, food, dressers full of clothing.
Where's that big key? There we go.
Before fleeing, the Palestinians spray-painted one of their shacks. "We will return one day," it says. The settlers have destroyed many of these structures in order to ensure that no one returns before they begin building a new, illegal Jewish development. This Palestinian, along with his children, lived in this village. They are now living on a small plot of land alongside other displaced residents. I spoke to him in a gas station parking lot because he was terrified of what settlers would do if they spotted him being interviewed by a foreign journalist.
طبعا احنا رحنا من بيوتنا نتيجة هجوم من المستوطنين والجيش هجموا علينا في 12 أكتوبر الساعة 12 الظهر. فجأنا في هجوم منسق بين الجيش الإسرائيلي والمستوطنين اللي لابسين مدني واللي لابسين جيش برضو معهم سلاح. يمكن تحكي عن 30 سيارة، أكثر من 70 عنصر بين جيش مستوطنين، بين مستوطنين لابسين مدني، كلهم حاملين سلاح. اللي مش حامل سلاح حامل عصا، حامل سكين، حامل. هجموا علينا وبلشوا فينا ضرب، بطحونا على الأرض وخبطوا علينا بجريهم، أخذوا الهوية تبعاتنا وأخذوا منا التلفونات عشان ما نصور ولا نثبت أي شيء. تقريبا أكثر من نص ساعة وهم باطحيننا على الأرض ومكلبشين إيدينا. ربطوا إيدينا في سلوك البناء في البلاستيك، ربطوا إيدينا. بعد نص ساعة تعذيب وبطح وضرب وإطلاق نار حكوا لنا معكم ساعة، لازم تأخذوا المواشي تبعاتكم والأولاد النسوان الموجودات وبتروحوا. ممنوع تأخذوا بيوت ولا شيء، ممنوع تأخذوا معكم. هيك بيحكي حتى نيريا بن باز اللي كان بيحكي والجيش، ممنوع تأخذوا ولا شيء، بدك تروح. كمان ساعة اللي يكون هون بدي يموت، راح نطلق عليه النار. وفي إطلاق نار على الغنم وعلى الناس وخبط وضرب الناس خافت وطلعت. هي فترة حرب، كلهم لبسوا جيش وصاروا بس يجوا على البيت بدهم يذبحوا ويضربوا ويقتلوا وسكروا علينا الطريق، بطل نقدر نيجي نروح نطلع نجيب اكل لاولادنا، اكل لمواشينا. يعني احنا عملوا علينا حصار، تغير الوضع صار أسوأ، يعني الذبح صار اسهل. انا بتمنى اني ارجع، بالعكس انا عايش حياة صعبة جدا هاي الايام. يعني انا عايش بدون بيت، بدون ولا اشي. يعني هيك انا عند الناس، لا حمام زي الناس، لا اكل زي الناس، لا شرب مي زي الناس. حتى المواشي تبعاتي لا في لهن اشي يغذيها عن المطر، ولا في عندنا اكل زي الناس. انا مش قادر ارجع لاني خايف على روحي، خايف على حياتي، لا ارجع من المستوطنين، خايف على اولادي، خايف على الناس.
Another West Bank Palestinian who's been forcibly displaced from his village is Mohammed. He now lives with his entire extended family in a tent on someone else's property.
تخيل لو اني في الرشاش، انا متت من الاكل، ماتوا الغنم تبعي ما قدرت اجيب لهم اكل للغنم، فانا كمان متت من قله الميه الاكل. هم في غزه قطعوا عنهم الميه والاكل والكهرباء، انا هون في الرشاش بدهم قطعوا عني الميه والكهرباء. طب انا ايش اسوي يعني بالنسبه لي؟ انا مش عايش في غزه، انا عايش هنا في الضفه وقطعوا عني الميه والكهرباء. نحن لو عسيبنا شو مدفار متى اني فلسطيني برخي فلسطيني ما هم عسيب بي، هم يعني يهرقوا ابليس سيبا تصير دموت وتسلق نوفتا كلها دموت، كل فلسطين من اشياء تخسي. في حياه صعبه في غزه. هذا حشر لما انفجر انفجار زي قبه زي الانفجار النووي. والمستوطنين هنيا في الضفه بيضغطوا على الفلسطينيه زي ما ضغطوا اسرائيل تضغط على غزه، ورايح الفلسطيني هنيون بينفجر زي ما انفجرت غزه على المستوطنين. نظل الوضع زي كذا ضغط. الشعب الفلسطيني هم اللي كلا هواء في حرب غزه هذه. هذول راحوا من ايش؟ من سياسه الحكومه الارهابيه، سياسه ارهابيه، سياسه ضغط، تسكير على الناس. طب هاي في ناس عرب ومسلمين عايشين في اوروبا، يجوا من سوريا عايشين في اوروبا، سووا مشاكل زي ما يسووا. ليش ما يصير تعايش ويهود؟ ليش ما يصير زي امريكا؟ هذه امريكا ولا اوروبا، ليش ما يصير تعايش بين لك حقك ولك حقك؟ لو في بتعايش بين المواطن بين المواطن ما بيصير زي كذا.
Let's talk about Palestinians who are arrested for their activism. You interview a woman who was detained in an Israeli prison, and then she's released as part of the November hostage exchange. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that report.
Sure. So this is now, I guess, 2 years ago. Her house was raided, just like her neighbors' houses have been dozens of times, just like her house has been dozens of times. And they made some vague accusations against her, as they do, all Palestinians living in the West Bank, saying that, you said something wrong, you talked to someone wrong, you posted something on social media that we didn't like. I don't know exactly what they told her. And they took her away and they put her in prison. And she was in prison under this administrative detention. And so she is not charged. She's a woman. She's not charged. She's in prison for however long the Israelis say. And she can be kept wherever the Israelis say. She's in a prison where her family doesn't know where she is. She has no rights. And this is a woman, probably the age of my mother. And this is in outside of Bethlehem in a refugee camp. And after interviewing her, I will say she reached back out to me, explaining that they just came and took her neighbor. This is just like that they took her. So this is not happening to one person. I didn't find the one person who this has happened to. This happens to all Palestinians. They get put in administrative detention for things for political speech, and this is just one of the women.
تم اعتقالي ب 4 ابريل السنة الماضية الساعة 6:10 الصبح. طبعا سبب الاعتقال هو لدواعي أمنية بتحكيها يعني أو هي الحجة دائما إنه خطير على الأمن الإسرائيلي.
While over 100 Israelis are being held captive in Gaza, Israel is holding over 10,000 Palestinians in its own jails. More than 3,000 of these Palestinians were arrested and detained without charge, trial, or the ability to appeal.
Wow.
The State of Israel calls this type of procedure administrative detention. It's reserved for Palestinians who engage in any type of political activity or speech against Israeli occupation and their family members. What it amounts to is official kidnapping. Radu Abba Ajamia is a 47-year-old Palestinian woman who's lived her entire life in the Dahesha refugee camp outside Bethlehem in the West Bank. She was taken from her home by military police last year and kept in one of the Israeli prisons. In November, Hamas used 50 Israelis they took prisoner on October 7th as political leverage to free 150 Palestinians from Israeli jails. Rauda is one of the Palestinian prisoners who was released. She served 7 months in Ofer prison and Damon prison. I traveled through dozens of military checkpoints in order to sit down with Rauda in her living room as she recounted her arrest, Israeli prison, and coming home.
هو داهموا مجموعة منازل بتخصنا اللي هي هان دار أختي. أنا كنت نايمة هون كان رمضان وداهموا داري بالحارة الوسطى ودور إخوتي. طبعا أغلب الأبواب فجروهن تفجير بالدار عندي غاد وهاد. بعد تقريبا أقل من 10 دقائق كانوا ماخذين ابن أختي انحرك لأنه ضربوا قنبلة صوت عشان ما يغلطوا كان الجنود معي. ما كان معهم مجندة اللي مفروض يعني تحط الكلبشات أو عصبة العين. فعند الدبابة تقريبا تحت عند الأهلية جندي اللي كلبشني وحط العصبة عيني وطلعنا على عصيون ومن عصيون لمقر ثاني اسمه بانوراما أول مرة بسمع فيه. وبعدها أخذوني لعوفر ضليت تقريبا ويوم الأحد الساعة 4 ثبتوا 4 أشهر إداري.
Without any hearing, without any trial, and no ability to appeal, Rauda was sent to prison. They also arrested her teenage nephew.
Let's move on to the Israeli settlers.
Can I just say one thing about that video real quick?
Yeah.
How I found that woman. We had a list given to us by Adamir, which is like a prisoner rights NGO in Ramallah. And it was a list of 50 people who were recently released from administrative detention. And out of the 50 people, only one, that woman, she's so courageous, only one was willing to speak to us. Everyone was so afraid that if they spoke to a journalist, they would get thrown right back in prison. So that's how arbitrary, that's how, strict, that's how scared these people are. Out of 50 people, almost everyone is too scared to just speak about their experience to a journalist, except her.
Well, and they're told when they're released not to speak out.
Yeah, truly. It makes it even more brave.
So you go down to one of the crossings, and it's a great report. And you spend time with the Israeli settlers. I think you're there for a week, who are with the collaboration of the army, of course, and the police, blocking the aid trucks coming from Egypt into Gaza. So talk about this first, and then we'll watch the clip from that report.
Sure. So I was there. I was in Jerusalem at the time, and I knew this was happening, and I didn't really know how exactly to, ingratiate myself or, kind of embed myself with these people. I at first drove down to these aid blocks, these direct action aid blocks, with a fellow journalist, like an anti-Zionist, like leftist journalist inside of Israel, and we walked around. I was interviewing people, and I noticed that this person was almost was getting a little too emotional. This person was kind of arguing with the settlers, and you're not going to change these people's minds. They're arguing about how many women and children in Gaza, et cetera, et cetera. And they were looking at me as if to say, we're not going to speak to these people. So I changed my strategy, and I began taking a bus that left from Jerusalem with them through the occupied West Bank. It would stop at settlements, pick up fathers and young children and mothers, and go through the West Bank all the way down south to the Karim Shalom, or then it's on border crossings. And they would take these buses through the West Bank, pick up the protesters, and bring them to the crossing. And once they would get to the crossing, I mean, this is a closed military zone. So, like, no one is allowed here. It's supposed to be allowed here. But as soon as these settlers show up, the military uses their presence as justification to shut down the aid crossing. So the military knows, the state of Israel knows, that if they actually shut down the aid crossing, there will be, international political outcry. So the settlers do it instead, and they use the settlers to justify shutting down, aid to Gaza. So they work hand in hand. The settlers, kind of rid the Israeli government of actual, political responsibility for not allowing aid into Gaza. And they were, sharing sandwiches, the army, and listen, they're not supposed to. It's illegal that they're there. But the military is giving them sandwiches, watermelon, ice pops. They're palling around, they're hanging out. And day after day, as soon as the settlers show up, and I'm with them, the blocking gets closed, no aid gets into Gaza, day after day after day. And they consider that a giant, giant success. And after I filed this report, I was told, these are fanatics. This isn't really the government line. These people are fringe, even though the military is working with them. Like, you could see that it's the government line. But now you have, people in the Knesset, people in the Likud party, arguing that they should stop aid, that they shouldn't send aid. Something that just a few months ago we were told is fringe, and no one was saying that. So it very quickly became, reality. And so that's a good intro. We could watch the video.
The police man, the head commander, came to us and said, okay, you guys came and blocked, we don't want to fight. And he said to us, I'll just lock the gate, you guys don't need to stand in the sun. We got lollipops, we got watermelon from the police.
Lollipops and watermelon.
Yeah, watermelons, and was great with them.
So no food, no nothing.
No, they don't deserve it. What I care? Kill them, I don't care.
Do you trust Palestinians?
No, I know all about them. I don't trust them. I want them out of here.
What do you think should happen to Gaza?
I want to be civilized with Jews from Israel.
My unit was in charge of explosions. We blew up houses of terrorists, mosque, UN offices. I remember we got into some UN office that was in charge of helping families in Gaza that was affected by the war, and we destroyed it.
We give pastries for the people, for the soldiers, for the cops, for everybody. This is what we give to our people. This is real humanitarian, okay? They need to block the aid to Gaza. They need to block the gas to Gaza. Everything to block, and this is what we do every week, 2, 3, 4 times a week.
And as the Bible says, this place is for us, it's promised for us, so they can starve to death to pay on the things that they've done to us on the 7th of October.
אני חושב שצריך, לא יודע, אני חושב שצריך כולם להיות מאוחדים ואנחנו צריכים, צריך להיכנס חזרה לעזה ולהשתלט שם על המדינה, להשתלט שתהיה מדינה שלנו.
Bibi is a puppet of Biden, because we cleaned all Gaza, except in Rafiah. why aren't we going in there? Because Biden asked us not to. That's the only reason. There's no reason not to.
That last segment, Jeremy, we actually see settlers walking on towards Gaza.
Yeah, they went into Gaza. These are the same people that were blocking the aid. Sometimes they would go to the northern part of the Gaza Strip, the Erez crossing, and they would have a caravan of people, and they would get to as close as they could to the Erez border crossing, and they would bring vinyl and plywood and drills and hammers, and the military would allow them into Gaza. Again, this is a closed military zone. There's not supposed to be any civilians here, let alone civilians crossing into Gaza. And they were building what they called symbolic outposts. And these are little sheds or houses that they would build on the Gaza side of the Erez border crossing, in a way to tell the government, like, we are ready to move to Gaza when you tell us that we're allowed to. And a lot of them are from Gush Katif, the last settlement that was in Gaza before the disengagement. And they're, calling for the resettlement and the Judaization of Gaza. And they say, settlements equal security. So if they believe if they were to settle in Gaza, then the military would have to protect them. And that means the military would be permanently occupying Gaza, and a permanent occupation of Gaza would lead to, no more October 7th, as they would argue.
If you speak out, even if you're Israeli, of course,
I think you ought to know I'm feeling very depressed.
Well, we have something that should take your mind off things.
It won't work. I have an exceptionally large mind.
Yeah, we know, but we need you to go down to the number 2 entry bay and pick up our stowaways and bring them up here.
Just that? I won't enjoy it. Don't talk to me about life.
again,
then the military would have to protect them, and that means the military would be permanently occupying Gaza, and a permanent occupation of Gaza would lead to, no more October 7th, as they would argue.
if you speak out, even if you're Israeli, of course, against the genocide in Gaza, you are targeted. And you have a report speaking to Israelis protesting the war. We're going to see just 3 clips from it. I'll let you set it up. One is from a Yom Kippur veteran. One is from a high school teacher, Mayor Baruchan, and the other is from the principal of a school, Yael Aylan. Just explain that report, and then we'll watch those clips.
Sure. So shortly after October 7th, there is a high school teacher named Mayor Baruchan, and he would post things on Facebook that would, to the effect of, Muhammad was 13 years old. Muhammad wanted to be a professional soccer player, but Muhammad will never be a professional soccer player because he was killed by our wonderful, men and women in the Gaza Strip. And so, he was trying to humanize children in Gaza through these Facebook posts. And his house was raided, his computers and his cell phones were seized, and he was put in solitary confinement for 8 or 9 days. and he was. They tried to charge him with incitement, which carries 25 years to 50 years in prison, and he eventually he was let out of prison. But I was there when he was originally getting arrested, and at the courthouse there was maybe a 10 or 15 person, older Israeli Jews there, showing their support for this Mayor Barukin, and they were brutally beaten by a special police force inside of Jerusalem. And so the first interview that we're going to see right now is one of the older men who was there voicing his support for Mayor Barukin, who was getting charged with incitement for simple Facebook posts, and he was beaten by the police.
To say it in one sentence, they came in order to beat us. I didn't see such cruelty, such violence from the side of Jerusalem police in terms of, chasing, eating, not hesitating to beat adults, I would say even old ladies. And people were cursed. I mean, the policemen didn't hesitate to curse people in sentences like, go to Gaza, go to East Jerusalem, go to Sheikh Jarrah, we don't want you, you are lousy leftists. This kind of stuff, they didn't hesitate as people of the law to curse citizens, and we did nothing. For me, it was a fascist event, really. Coming and doing these horrible things to the people who respect the law, who did nothing. I was attacked in Jerusalem, and my son, Nadav, serves in the army very near the northern border. I mean, to treat me as a Yom Kippur War veteran and the First Lebanese War veteran, as a traitor, as a person whom you have to attack, whom you have to curse or mock, is impossible. By shouting or saying different things that are not, in the national consensus, you reveal yourself as a traitor.
And we should be clear that older man that you interviewed, he is a veteran from the Yom Kippur War, and his son is in the military.
Yeah, he used to be. I mean, he's not like an anti-Zionist by any means. He lives in Israel. He's Jewish. He served in the army. His son is in the army. He just didn't believe that, this high school teacher, Mayor Barukin, should be in prison for 50 years for trying to humanize Gazan children on his Facebook. And that's the level where they're at in terms of, repressing freedom of speech inside of Israel against, Israeli Jews, not even Palestinians.
So this last clip we're going to look at is probably the one that got you in, really serious trouble. And this is your reporting on the Iranian airstrikes in Israel. Although I want to, before we talk about it, be clear that you weren't the only one who showed footage from strikes. They came very close to hitting the Mossad headquarters in Tel Aviv, but you weren't the only one who did it. But of course, they went after you, and I think, having shown clips from all of these reports, we can understand why. So talk about this last report, and then after that, we're going to talk about what happened to you.
Sure. So my original plan was to go to the northern West Bank on this most recent trip to spend time in the refugee camps in Jenin, around Nablus, Tulkarm, where there's been, regular raids and sieges, and, they shut off the water. There's, it's one of the few places, in the West Bank where there is, there's resistance. And so, these people don't want them entering the refugee camp. The Palestinians don't want the military to come in. And so I wanted to go there and document the destruction caused by these raids and speak to people who have to deal with these raids. And, for the first time in a long time, There's been a handful of airstrikes in the northern West Bank. People are saying it's another front opening up in this war. So that was my plan. But the day I got to Israel, we had it was October 1st, and that was the day of the Iranian ballistic missile retaliatory attack. And I spoke to my editor and friend Max Blumenthal. He said, you are there. Maybe you should file a report about this missile strike. I thought, I don't really know what to say about it. Everyone's talking about it. How about if I just try to find where the missiles landed? Maybe that's just that could be the report. I do that. I go to the Nevatim Air Base in the south. I don't really see much. I go to the Mossad headquarters around there. There's a filled-in crater. I document it. I look at the news, and because I'm only one person, I'm not a news crew. My turnaround was a few days. So my report came out after the mainstream media, PBS NewsHour, Ynet. Mainstream Israeli media and American media situated inside of Israel published very similar information that I did, and only I was, acted on and arrested. So we could watch a part of that video and talk about it.
Great.
I'm Jeremy Lafredo for the Gray Zone in Israel, where last night Iran fired over 200 ballistic missiles in retaliation for the assassinations of Lebanese and Iranian political and military leadership. Since the missile strikes, Israeli authorities have attempted to downplay the significance of the attacks, censor the locations of missile impacts from media publication, and claim that Iran was targeting Israeli civilians. What I saw today, here in Israel, is clear evidence that Iran was targeting the same Israeli intelligence and military infrastructure that's been used over the past year to carry out brutal assassinations and attacks.
The military took away most of the missile, but there was still a piece left. The missile fell a quarter-mile west of Nevatim Air Base and about a quarter-mile from the Bedouin village, which is unrecognized by Israel, so it isn't supplied with any type of state-of-the-art bomb shelters like Jewish communities.
Where were people in the communities around here hiding yesterday during the sounds?
الناس كانت تشرد للمدارس وين ما في ملاجئ أو لوين ما في جسر كانوا يلدوا تحت الجسر. أكيد لا، لأن ما في ملاجئ وما في أماكن آمنة للناس.
كان يجي يتخبوا في الوقت هذا. Many people sheltered here last night with the sounds of the rockets. They came and hide here.
Using visual clues from footage circulating online, I set out to locate where the missile may have landed. Driving down a street I believe to be in one of the missile videos, I saw a heavily damaged SUV, its windshield shattered, debris and concrete caked into the vehicle. Further down, the scene unfolded. Destroyed vehicles, torn up asphalt, and a massive crater, roughly 30 feet wide, recently filled in with dirt.
That's the Mossad headquarters.
The missile had hit less than 1,000 feet from Mossad headquarters. This information is missing from all Israeli media reports due to the fact it's been officially censored. Right here are the censored coordinates. Given the proximity to what is considered one of the world's most advanced intelligence agencies, it seemed clear that Israel was taking extra precautions to conceal the exact impact location. As we left the area, an unsettling incident occurred. Our cell phones lost GPS functionality, maps went blank, and then both devices, mine and my taxi driver's, suddenly showed we were at Amman's airport in Jordan, over 120 miles west.
So, now, explain what happened. I think you were at a checkpoint. Were you in Kalandia in
I was
Ramallah? But explain what happened.
I was finally, it was the first day where I finally was getting to do what I went there to do, which was reporting the northern West Bank. I was at a checkpoint maybe 15 minutes outside of Nablus, and the military asked everyone in the car with me, there was 5 of us, to hand over our passports. which isn't super strange, asking for ID at a checkpoint, hundreds of checkpoints in the West Bank. I wasn't nervous at all. I give the passport to him, and then they came back and they asked for us all to hand over our cell phones. And my phone was locked, and I knew all the information on my phone. Maybe I was, communicating with people who were in the northern West Bank, who maybe knew people, who would be considered by them as resistance fighters, as the military, as terrorists. But it's, valid journalistic inquiry for me to, be communicating with these people for interviews. So yeah, I handed over my cell phone. Everyone did except one journalist. He refused to, and he had a gun pointed at his face. He was dragged out of the car. He was punched a few times, and then they took his phone as well, and then told all of us to get out of the car and stand on the street, sit on the street beside the military checkpoint. And then maybe after an hour of us sitting on the dirt, one of the Army officers pointed at me and said, "Mr. Lafredo, will you come here?" And so I crossed the street towards the checkpoint, and I said, "What's happening?" And they said, "You're being arrested." And they pulled out maybe 20 or 30 feet of blindfold cloth, and they wrapped it tightly around my head, maybe 10 or 15 times, around my ears, my eyes, and part of my nose. They shackled my legs, and they zip tied my hands. And then I was put in a military Humvee and kind of arbitrarily driven around. And then it stopped. I was then transferred into a police car, or what seemed to be a police car. I was blindfolded still. And then the police car drove about an hour south towards Jerusalem. It took me to the biggest police headquarters in the West Bank, and I was put in a holding cell. My blindfold was finally taken off my head. I was in the holding cell, and they actually they arrested all of us who were in the car. So we were all here at this kind of West Bank military compound. The other journalists that I was with were allowed to go home, and that's kind of when I thought to myself, maybe this is something more serious for me, because everyone's allowed to go home except me. And I heard them playing this report, my voice. I heard my own voice when I was sitting in my holding cell. I heard them listening to my report, so I knew it was something. Not that I was at a checkpoint, not that I was with maybe some people that I was with have Israeli citizenship.